We were told we were living in an age of prosperity, that the markets were booming, the economy was strong, and our future, was secure. But that was a lie. A carefully crafted illusion projected on the walls of a collapsing house. We built an empire not on stone, not on integrity, not on labor that sustains, but on the shifting sands of speculation, credit, and deceit. We became addicted to the fantasy of endless growth, to the sweet intoxication of numbers rising on screens, while beneath us the real foundation, the human foundation, was rotting away. You see, this illusion of prosperity was not merely economic, it was spiritual, it was moral. We were told that wealth itself was a sign of virtue, that to be successful was to be righteous, that the accumulation of things equaled the fulfillment of life. But that was the poison, the great seduction, because behind the shimmering glass towers and the manicured lawns of suburbia, something sacred was dying. Families were drowning in debt, workers were being exploited to feed the profits of unseen masters, and the poor, always the poor, were told that their suffering was their own fault. We were promised freedom through consumption. We were promised happiness through ownership, but what we received was enslavement, to banks, to credit, to corporations that saw in us not citizens, not souls, but consumers. And when the bills came due, when the illusion began to crack, we discovered how hollow the promise had always been. Because this system, this glittering edifice of prosperity, was never designed to last, it was designed to extract, to drain, to use. Do you understand the cruelty of it? We measured our worth not by the content of our character, but by the size of our house, the brand of our car, the logo stitched on our shirt. We called that success, we called that the American dream, but what we were really chasing was approval, an illusion of identity sold back to us by the same system that stripped us of our meaning. We became slaves to appearances, prisoners of our own vanity, unable to see that the real wealth of a nation is not in its stock prices, but in the moral fiber of its people. And while we were distracted by the glow of our screens, the real architects of this illusion, the bankers, the hedge fund managers, the political elites, were dismantling the safeguards that once protected the common good. They knew the game was rigged. They knew the debt was unsustainable, but they didn't care. Because their wealth was not built on creation, it was built on manipulation. They made money not by producing anything of value, but by gambling with the livelihoods of millions. And when their bets failed, it was not they who paid the price, it was us. The illusion of prosperity is not just about numbers or policies, it's about power. It's about control. When people believe they are free, when they believe they are thriving, they do not question the hand that feeds them. And so the illusion must be maintained at all costs. Keep them busy. Keep them consuming. Keep them afraid of losing what little they have. And slowly, quietly, the very essence of democracy is sold piece by piece to the highest bidder. But here's the truth most will not face. We are living in the ruins of that illusion right now. The bridges are collapsing. The schools are failing. The healthcare system is crumbling under greed. And yet we still cling to the fantasy that if we just work harder, spend more, believe more fervently in the market, somehow everything will be okay. That is the delusion of a people who have forgotten how to see. The illusion of prosperity has a cost, and that cost is always human. It's the father who works 3 jobs and still cannot feed his children. It's the mother who chooses between medicine and rent. It's the graduate buried under mountains of debt before life even begins. It's the quiet despair that sits at the dinner table of millions who did everything they were told, played by the rules, and still found themselves discarded by a system that never intended to keep them. And yet, within that suffering lies a truth that the architects of illusion fear: the awakening. The moment when people see through the glitter, when they recognize the deception, when they understand that the empire of wealth is not a symbol of strength, but of decay. Because once a people awaken to the lie, once they reclaim their capacity for moral outrage, for solidarity, for truth, then the illusion shatters. And when it shatters, everything built upon it trembles. We are living in that moment of trembling now. The masks are slipping. The truth is breaking through. And though it is painful, though it demands that we confront our complicity, our apathy, our silence, it is the only path back to what is real, to rebuild what was lost, not in marble or gold, but in courage, compassion, and truth. because only when the illusion dies can a nation begin to live again. And what we began to call life after the illusion broke was not life at all, but survival, because the sickness had already taken root deep within us, the worship of money. It had replaced faith, replaced compassion, replaced truth. It had become the new god of the modern age, adorned not with candles and hymns, but with stock tickers and credit cards. We no longer prayed in churches, we prayed in banks. We no longer sought salvation in the spirit, we sought it in the market. And in that silent exchange, we sold something sacred. When a people start to believe that wealth is the highest virtue, they begin to confuse success with goodness and greed with strength. They start to think that those who have more are somehow worth more. And in that terrible lie, the human heart begins to die. You can see it everywhere, on the screens that celebrate billionaires as saviors, in the headlines that glorify profit as progress, in the voices that whisper that if you are poor, you have failed. We have been catechized in the liturgy of consumption. The economy became our temple. The dollar became our god. We built a society where everything could be bought, where nothing was sacred, where even love was a transaction and human worth a commodity. We began to measure ourselves not by integrity or wisdom or kindness, but by how much we could earn, how much we could own, how much we could take. And so we became hollow, empty vessels of insatiable desire, chasing numbers that could never satisfy the hunger of the soul. That is what happens when a culture abandons the divine for the dollar. It becomes a graveyard of meaning, decorated with luxury and despair. You can feel the despair in the air now, the anxiety, the exhaustion, the quiet panic that hums beneath the noise of endless marketing. Because when you worship money, you are always afraid of losing it, of not having enough, of being seen as less than those who do. Fear becomes the governing spirit of life. And fear is the enemy of love, of empathy, of community. We no longer know how to care for one another because we've been told the only person who matters is the one staring back from the mirror. That is the dark miracle of the market. It isolates while it enriches, it dehumanizes while it dazzles. The worship of money doesn't just corrupt individuals, it corrodes nations. It turns governments into subsidiaries of corporate power. It makes justice a privilege for sale. It silences truth tellers and rewards deceivers. And in its hunger, it devours everything, nature, morality, even the future of our children. It teaches us to look at the world not as something to protect, but as something to exploit. The rivers, the forests, the oceans, all of it reduced to resources, all of it consumed to feed the insatiable idol of profit. And the church of this new religion preaches that it is all for the greater good, that wealth will trickle down, that prosperity will lift all boats, that competition will perfect the world. But look around, do you see perfection? Do you see uplift? Or do you see a planet suffocating, families crushed beneath rent, young people drowning in debt, and billionaires building bunkers in preparation for the storm they helped create? That is not progress. That is not prosperity. That is decay disguised as success, and yet we keep believing, because belief in money's power gives us a sense of control in a world we no longer understand. We cling to it as we once clung to faith, thinking if we just work harder, save more, invest wisely, somehow we'll be spared from the collapse. But no one is spared, not truly, because the worship of money demands a sacrifice, and what it demands most is the human soul. There was a time when we believed that the measure of a person was found in their compassion, in their courage to stand for what was right, in their willingness to give rather than take. That time feels like a distant memory now. We traded that moral compass for comfort, that conscience for convenience. We became spectators in our own decline, watching the spectacle of greed unfold as though it were entertainment. And in our silence, in our apathy, we became complicit. But something stirs beneath the surface, a faint remembering of who we once were, because the truth cannot be buried forever. Somewhere within us, the human spirit still resists the idol. It still whispers that life is more than profit, that meaning cannot be purchased, that love cannot be sold. It is that whisper that terrifies the powerful. Because when people rediscover their sacred worth, when they remember that no amount of money can define the value of a soul, the empire of greed begins to crumble. So the question before us now is not economic, It is moral, it is spiritual. What kind of people do we wish to become? Do we continue to bow before the altar of wealth, or do we dare to stand again for what cannot be bought? For truth, for justice, for the sanctity of life itself. Because if we cannot reclaim that, if we cannot remember that the soul of a nation is not measured in dollars but in decency, then the worship of money will finish what it began. It will consume us whole. And when a nation forgets its soul, it forgets its people. That is the cruelest truth of all. Because in the great machinery of wealth and power, the working class, the backbone of America, was betrayed. Not by accident, not by neglect, but by design. Those who built the roads, who laid the rail, who forged the steel, and carried the nation through its darkest wars, were cast aside when their labor was no longer profitable. The covenant between the worker and the republic was broken quietly, methodically, until dignity itself became a luxury few could afford. They told us it was progress. They said automation, globalization, efficiency, these were the signs of an advancing world. But progress for whom? Efficiency for whom? Because while factories shuttered and towns withered, while fathers and mothers watched their livelihoods evaporate, the profits soared for those at the top. Entire communities became wastelands of forgotten dreams, empty storefronts, silent assembly lines, and children growing up in the shadow of despair. And still, they called it progress. The betrayal was not only economic, it was moral. For the working class had believed in something sacred, that hard work was honorable. That labor had dignity, that if you gave your best, your country would stand with you. But that promise was shattered. The men and women who built America were told they were obsolete. They were told the market had no place for them. And in the sterile language of economics, outsourcing, downsizing, cost-cutting, their lives were erased. The betrayal of the working class is not a tragedy of numbers. It is a tragedy of the human spirit. You can see it in the eyes of the truck driver who sleeps in his cab because rent is too high. You can hear it in the voice of the factory worker whose job was shipped overseas, whose hands still ache for the craft that gave his life meaning. These are not statistics. These are lives sacrificed on the altar of profit. And the nation that abandons them abandons itself. Once labor was sacred. Once unions stood as fortresses of solidarity, the great equalizer against unchecked power. But the corporate elite understood something profound, that to control a people, you must first divide them. So they waged war not only on wages, but on unity. They demonized unions, mocked the poor, pitted worker against worker, neighbor against neighbor. They replaced solidarity with suspicion. They taught us to despise the very people who share our struggle, to blame the immigrant, the outsider, the one just as desperate to survive. And while we turned on each other, they laughed. The betrayal runs deeper still, because the political class, the very people sworn to protect the public good, became the servants of corporate masters. They traded the pain of the worker for campaign checks and power. They passed laws written by lobbyists. They cut taxes for billionaires and called it freedom. They gutted protections, dismantled safety nets, and told the suffering to lift themselves up by bootstraps that no longer existed. They called it the invisible hand of the market, as if it were divine will. But it was not divine, it was deliberate. And in that betrayal, something sacred in the American story broke. The belief that every man and woman, through honest work, could build a life of dignity. That belief became a myth. We are now a nation divided between those who labor and those who own, between those who create and those who exploit. The working class became invisible, their struggles hidden behind the glare of corporate propaganda. They were told to be grateful for what little they had, even as the rich devoured everything in sight. But the truth is this: no nation can survive when its foundation is despised. The working class is not a relic. It is the heartbeat of the republic. And when you crush that heartbeat, the entire body begins to die. You can feel it now, in the rage that simmers beneath the surface, in the despair that fills small towns, in the silent anger of those who have given up on the idea that anyone in power still speaks for them. That anger is not blind. It is the cry of betrayal echoing through generations. And yet within that cry lies the seed of renewal. Because when the working class awakens to its own power, when it remembers that no economy, no corporation, no empire exists without the labor of its people, then the balance begins to shift. History has shown it before. The moment the forgotten stand together, the mighty tremble. We are standing again at that threshold. The betrayal cannot go unanswered. The time is coming when the abandoned will no longer beg for justice but will demand it. And in that demand lies the hope that this nation, born in struggle and sacrifice, might once again remember its soul, not in the boardrooms of the powerful, but in the calloused hands of those who never stopped building, even as the world forgot their names. Because after the betrayal came the addiction. The empire of consumption rose from the ashes of broken labor, feeding on the very despair it had created. When people lost meaning in work, when purpose was stripped from their hands, the system offered them substitutes. Cheap credit, cheap goods, cheap pleasure. It told them that happiness could still be bought, that the void in their hearts could be filled by the next purchase, the next gadget, the next fleeting thrill. And so the nation was reprogrammed, not to produce, but to consume, to feed the machine that had already devoured its soul. The empire of consumption is built on deception, an endless cycle of want disguised as choice. We were told we were free because we could choose between brands, between models, between the same hollow variations of the same disposable things. But freedom without meaning is slavery. The shelves were full, but our hearts were empty. The advertisements became our catechism, teaching us that identity could be worn, driven, or downloaded, that we were what we owned, that fulfillment was just one purchase away, and like all false religions, it demanded sacrifice, the sacrifice of time, of community, of spirit. We became a people defined not by what we build, but by what we buy. The worker who once took pride in creation was now reduced to a consumer, measured by his credit score and spending power. And when the wages fell, when the jobs disappeared, the banks stepped in with a smile and a loan. They called it opportunity. They called it freedom. But it was a trap, a golden leash of debt that would keep millions chained for life. We mistook enslavement for empowerment because it was dressed in the language of progress. The empire of consumption feeds on illusion. It thrives on the manipulation of desire. It manufactures emptiness, then sells the cure. It tells the lonely they can buy companionship, the insecure they can buy beauty, the lost they can buy belonging. And in that quiet desperation, a nation is hollowed out. Neighborhoods once bound by solidarity became battlegrounds of envy and competition. The small joys of community, conversation, generosity, shared struggle were replaced by isolation and screen-lit distraction. We became strangers to one another, alone in our abundance. And what happens to a people who consume more than they create? They begin to eat their own future. Every empire of consumption eventually turns inward, devouring the very resources, the very humanity that sustain it. The soil erodes, the oceans choke, the forests burn, the climate breaks, and through it all, the markets cheer, mistaking destruction for growth. Because in the empire of consumption, even death is profitable. The collapse of the natural world becomes another investment opportunity. It is a sickness of the spirit, a hunger that cannot be satisfied because it is not physical. We buy more and feel less. We own more and understand less. We accumulate until we are buried beneath the weight of our possessions, and still the emptiness grows. Because what we are starving for cannot be found in a store. It is not for sale. It is meaning, belonging, purpose, things that cannot be bought, only lived. And yet the illusion is powerful. It promises escape from the pain of reality. It numbs the despair of a collapsing world with the narcotic of consumption. It whispers that if you just keep buying, keep scrolling, keep feeding, you won't have to face what's dying inside you. But that death cannot be avoided. It seeps into every corner of our lives, the anxiety, the restlessness, the quiet sorrow of a people who no longer know why they exist. We were not made to be consumers. We were made to be creators, to build, to nurture, to give form to beauty and meaning. But in the empire of consumption, creation is subversive. To create is to resist, because creation requires care, patience, and attention, all things the system cannot tolerate. The act of creating something real, art, craft, community, truth, is an act of rebellion against a culture that values nothing it cannot sell. And so, the question becomes not how much more we can consume, but how much longer we can endure. How long can a nation survive when its identity is built on appetite? How long can a people remain free when their desires are manufactured for profit? Every empire of consumption reaches the same end. It collapses under the weight of its own greed. And when it does, the illusion shatters, leaving behind a haunting silence, the echo of everything we traded for convenience. But perhaps within that silence lies a chance for redemption. Perhaps when the noise of consumption finally fades, we will begin to hear again the faint sound of our own humanity, the still, quiet voice that reminds us that we are not what we buy, but what we love, what we build, what we give. That is the voice the empire fears most, because when people remember that truth, when they reject the lie that their worth is measured in possessions, the entire structure trembles. The empire cannot survive when the soul of its people reawakens. And as the empire trembles, so too does the conscience of the nation. Because when a people lose their sense of truth, when deception becomes the air they breathe, corruption no longer feels like a crime, it feels like the norm. The collapse of moral leadership did not happen overnight. It began slowly, quietly, as those in power learned that the appearance of virtue was more profitable than virtue itself. They no longer led to serve, they led to perform. Politics became theater, and truth became its first casualty. You can see it in their eyes, the polished smiles, the carefully rehearsed empathy, the hollow promises that fill the airwaves before every election. These are not leaders, they are actors reading lines written by the wealthy. Every word they speak has been tested, weighed, and sold, and behind the curtain stand the real masters of the state, corporations, lobbyists, financiers writing laws that protect their empires while the people are fed illusions of choice. We were told democracy still lived, but what we have now is a managed democracy, a spectacle of consent where power remains untouched and the will of the people is reduced to a slogan. Truth no longer has a place in this new order. It has been commodified, packaged, and weaponized. The news no longer informs, it entertains. It no longer challenges, it distracts. The journalists who once held power to account have been replaced by pundits who serve it. They trade integrity for access, conscience for comfort. They have forgotten that truth, real truth, is dangerous, that it should unsettle, disturb, and expose. In its absence, a nation loses its compass. It drifts into madness, mistaking spectacle for reality, propaganda for wisdom. Justice, too, has been sold. The courts no longer serve the weak, they protect the powerful. Corporations commit crimes on a scale that dwarfs the sins of any individual, yet their punishment is a fine, a cost of doing business. Meanwhile, the poor rot in overcrowded prisons for crimes of survival. That is the great hypocrisy of our age. We worship the law when it serves power, and we ignore it when it demands conscience. We call ourselves a nation of justice, but justice without truth is nothing more than vengeance disguised as order. And in the vacuum of moral leadership, deceit becomes a virtue. Those who tell the truth are silenced, mocked, or exiled. Whistleblowers are branded as traitors. Prophets are dismissed as extremists. We have reached a point where honesty is treated as a threat and lies as a form of patriotism. The state demands obedience, not morality. It rewards conformity and punishes conscience. And so, those who dare to see, those who dare to speak, are left to stand alone, ostracized by the very society they are trying to save. The collapse of moral leadership infects everything it touches. It seeps into our schools, our churches, our communities. The young grow up in a world where corruption is normalized, where ambition is defined by self-interest, where the pursuit of truth is seen as naive. What does it do to a generation to grow up believing that integrity is weakness? That success is measured not by character, but by wealth and manipulation. It breeds cynicism, despair, and moral exhaustion. And that is the point. A demoralized people are easier to control. They do not resist, they retreat. But moral collapse does not only destroy institutions, it destroys the human soul. When lies become law and deceit becomes culture, we begin to mirror the very corruption we despise. We learn to lie to ourselves, to justify what we know is wrong, to silence the small voice of conscience that still whispers in the dark, and in that silence something vital within us dies. Because once truth is no longer sacred, nothing is. Love, justice, faith, all of it becomes hollow words without the spine of honesty to sustain them. And yet, even now, amid the decay, there are those who refuse to kneel, those who will not barter truth for comfort or trade their conscience for survival. They are few, but they are the last torchbearers in an age of shadows. They remind us that moral courage begins not in the halls of power, but in the quiet defiance of ordinary people who refuse to lie, a teacher who tells the truth to her students despite the cost, a journalist who exposes what others fear to speak, a worker who stands against exploitation. These are the prophets of our time, uncelebrated, often broken, but unyielding. The collapse of moral leadership will not be reversed by elections or slogans. It will only be healed by sacrifice, by those willing to bear the weight of truth in an age that despises it. For truth always demands a price, but it is only through that price that redemption becomes possible. Because a nation that loses its truth is doomed, but a people who reclaim it, even in the ruins, can build again, not on illusion, but on integrity. And that rebuilding begins not with power, but with conscience, with the courage to say no to the lie, no matter how loud the world demands otherwise. And when conscience returns, it does not come gently. It comes like a storm, merciless, cleansing, unstoppable. Every lie we have told, every injustice we have tolerated, every truth we have buried rises to the surface demanding to be answered. This is the reckoning. Not the reckoning of the markets, not the fall of stock prices or the closing of banks, but the reckoning of the soul.